Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to another program by the Racine Coalition for Peace and Justice. And we want to thank Pastor Tony Larson and the friends and members of Rabbi Brant for letting us use the facility. The programs that RCPJ puts forward here are not necessarily backed by the church as such, but they do let us use the facility, and we're very happy about that. This is the second in our series on pursuing peace. The last one was last month when Professor Saif Dada from UW Parkside spoke about the roots of ISIS. And tonight we have a featured speaker whom I will introduce soon. And next month, Professor Rachel Buff from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee will come down and get us better acquainted with the Jewish Voice for Peace. Her topic will be Jewish Voice for Peace, Visions of Liberation and Solidarity. This is a lively, difficult, complicated peace process, and what we try to do is to give a chance for various voices to speak about the issues. And this is a voice that we don't get to hear very often, but we're very happy tonight to have Rabbi Brant Rosen with us. Once in a while, when I look at people's bios, I think, boy, I'd like to meet that person. Tonight I had that chance. I looked at his bio, and if I really paid attention to it, I'd take too much of his speaking time, but I want to hit the high points, if I may. There aren't any low points, as a matter of fact, they're all high points. Let me get the script out here. So, a native of California, his undergraduate degree from UCLA, and his rabbinical degree from Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. He is currently the Midwest Regional Director of the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker group, and he's served as rabbi of Jewish Reconstructionist congregation in Evanston for 16 years, I think, until just recently. And he's former president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and co-founder and co-chairperson of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council. He has, as you might be, he's been an activist for peace, social justice, human rights, and has traveled to former Soviet Union, when it was still a Soviet Union, Nigeria, Rwanda, Uganda, and Iran. So he's a well-traveled man, among other things. He's also a very dedicated environmentalist. His synagogue that was built with the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation in Evanston received a platinum rating by the U.S. Green Building Council. And he was also the recipient of a Chicago Magazine's Green Award for the environmental leadership in 2009. So those are some of the high points. There aren't any low points. Okay. He does have a book out called Wrestling in the Daylight, A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity. I found you can get it on Amazon.com for just under $20 plus shipment. And I intend to get that. It contains, I gather, a number of your blogs and then responses from various people about the issue that he struggles with. But at any rate, we're very pleased to have you tonight, Rabbi Brant Rosen. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Wayne, and thank you all for coming. Whenever I speak, I really appreciate the opportunity to have conversations. So I will be speaking for about between a half hour and 45 minutes, and really want to devote as much time as I can to discussion and response, and to hear your thoughts and questions about anything I have to say on the subject tonight, or anything related to what I have to say. It's a vast, deep and wide subject matter. So I'm happy, to the best of my ability, to engage in conversation on, as Wayne said, this very painful and difficult issue. I think in many ways the Jewish community is, the Jewish community is a vast and wide organism unto itself. And I think it's moving and evolving on this issue as well. And that's in some ways a part of the point of my presentation with you tonight. But I will be addressing the issue of Zionism specifically. The extent to which Zionism and Judaism have become conflated. And really, I'll state my thesis at the outset, I'll lay my cards on the table at the outset, and say that I believe that Zionism and Judaism have, at this point in time, become erroneously conflated. I think too many people jump to the conclusions, Jews and non-Jews alike, that somehow Zionism and Judaism are one and the same, or that Judaism necessarily contains Zionist ideals and values. And my presentation here tonight is to unpack that assumption, that narrative, and to explore the history of Zionism and understand that at its core, Zionism is a modern political movement. And it is certainly possible to be a Jew and a Zionist, but it is also very possible to be Jew and not be a Zionist. And in fact, Zionism in its origin was a very controversial and hotly debated movement when it first arrived on the scene in the 19th century. And political Zionism, when I talk about Zionism, I'm really referring to the notion of creating, the notion of Jewish political nationalism, creating a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine, was by no means a consensus idea when it first came on the scene, and I would say that it continues to be a point of contention in many, many important ways. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Judaism itself, how Zionism, I think, changed people's assumptions about Judaism, particularly in the modern period, and then introduce you to some very, very important Jewish figures who were opposed to Zionism in the 19th and 20th century, and talk a little bit about where we're going from here. I want to say at the outset that I don't necessarily assume that everyone here is going to agree with everything I have to say, although I'm always delighted when that's the case, but it almost never happens. And that's great. In fact, I seriously prefer that. I enjoy being part of conversations where we can have a wide tent and agree to disagree on the places where we don't find commonality, but to have civil and respectful dialogue. And so I want to put that out on the front end, that I'm giving you my thesis, but not with any expectation that there is uniform agreement on this issue in the room today. I want to begin a little bit personally, and to say that for most of my life, up until relatively recently, I considered myself to be a Zionist. I was raised in a home, like many American middle-class Jews, that identified very deeply with Israel. In fact, I first visited Israel when I was very young, probably eight or nine, and I visited and been there more times at this point than I can count. I lived there for 2 years at one point when I was an undergraduate, and actually considered, entertained the idea of moving there, as many of my friends did. I also have family in Israel, so I'm very familiar with Israel, and my Judaism throughout my entire life has in many ways been informed by the state of Israel and by Zionism as I started to learn about Zionism and identify as a Zionist. I will also say that along the way, there were aspects of Zionism that I found troubling and difficult and struggled with. And I was never able to fully vanquish those struggles. In fact, they really increased over time rather than lessened. And it was only relatively recently, I would say in the last 10 plus years, that I have broken with what I would call the official Zionist narrative of the necessity and importance of having a political Jewish nation state in historic Palestine. And we can talk a little bit about that, but that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'm a student of Zionism. I understand how important it has been in modern American Jewish identity, but I also understand that it is by no means the sine qua non of Jewish identity. That I think it's very important for people, Jews and non-Jews alike, to understand that Judaism and Zionism are not synonymous, and we need to really understand our terms and be clear about what we're talking about when we so too often casually conflate the two. So the first thing I want to say is, the first claim I want to make is that it's very important to realize that Judaism itself, Jewish tradition, in its origins, after the destruction of the Second Temple in the first century, was at its core a diaspora-based religion, and was for thousands and thousands of years. Before Judaism as we know it came on the scene, the roots of Judaism lay in ancient Israel, as I'm sure you all know, and it was focused in that land. I'll just refer to it as the land, and the focus was very geographic. It was the focus of worship was the temple in Jerusalem. The main form of worship was animal sacrifice, and this was really proto-Judaism. It was ancient Israelite religion, and up through the time of the Second Temple, many of these ancient Israelite groups started to fractionalize and go in different directions. We had the Pharisees, we had the Sadducees, we had the Essenes, we had the early Christians at one point. And after the destruction of the temple, Pharisaic tradition, the Pharisees, ended up becoming what we know as today Jewish tradition. And when the temple was destroyed, it was a time of great crisis, as you might understand, because the focal point of this tradition had been ripped away, and Jews were not, the Jewish people were not allowed to live in the land anymore. They were cast out into the diaspora, and that could have been the moment where we threw in the towel, so to speak. The rabbis could have said, well, we had a nice run, but we'd have no place to worship God anymore, and God was always geographically identified with this place in Jerusalem. And to me, I understand the genius, the spiritual genius of Judaism was that at that moment of crisis, the rabbis, if you will, reconstructed tradition to say, no, actually, God is not geographically specific. God can be found anywhere. There's this notion in Hebrew, God is referred to, among other things, as the Shekhinah, which literally means the indwelling presence of God. That wherever the Israelites went, God would follow. Wherever Jews formed communities throughout the diaspora, God would dwell among them. As long as the mitzvot were followed, God's commandments were followed, the commandments that fell under the categories of worship and dietary and so many different aspects of Jewish life, that was the way we worshiped God, and it was geographically portable. You could take it anywhere. And that is what allowed Judaism really to survive the destruction of the temple and throughout the centuries. No matter where Jews lived, God dwelt among them. And the Jewish people were able to forge this remarkable identity where they maintained their sense of peoplehood and connection to one another. The Hebrew term is Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. And when I say the people of Israel, it's important to that the word Israel for thousands of years meant the people of Israel. When Israel was chosen, Yisrael in Hebrew, was chosen as the name for this nation state in 1948 by David Ben-Gurion, it created a whole new set of baggage and assumptions about what that word meant. But it's important to know that for thousands of years, the word Israel did not refer to a political nation state. It referred to a peoplehood, a people who were transnational, who were multi-ethnic, but still maintained the sense of connection to one another through the sense of being part of the Am Yisrael, part of the people of Israel. That, I believe, is what allowed Judaism and the Jewish people to survive, often in very, very dire and difficult circumstances, this sense of being at one throughout the Jewish diaspora. So that's the first point I really want to make about Jewish tradition, is that it has always been, for thousands of years, a diaspora-centric religion. The other thing that I think is very important to point out is that, according to the rabbis, the notion of going back to the land of Israel and reestablishing the third Commonwealth, the third Jewish state in ancient Palestine, in historic Palestine rather, was always frowned upon. It was considered forcing God's hand. It was not allowed. It was certainly a mitzvah, or it was considered a wonderful thing for individuals to live in that land as individuals. But the notion of creating an independent Jewish state by human beings was considered an anathema to the rabbis. In fact, they said the only one who can create that state is God, and that's when the Messiah comes. When the Messiah comes, that third Jewish commonwealth will be established. But until that time, we do not force God's hand. We live in the countries in which we reside. And as I said, God dwells among us. That was made very, very clear over and over again. And there are very pious Jews today who are non-Zionist. Among others, they're known as the Neturei Karta. Some of you may have heard of this group. Who are fiercely anti-Zionist for precisely these reasons, because they oppose political Zionism because they see this as sacrilegious. They see this as forcing God's hand and going against God's will by taking history into our own hands and going to the ancient homeland and creating a new nation state. So that's the other piece I want to make very clear, is that the idea of, not only was Judaism a diaspora-centered tradition, but the idea of creating, for Jews themselves to create a Jewish state in that land was also considered to be against God's will. It was only really in the modern period when Zionism arose that this notion came on the scene, and that's very, very important. And in the scheme of things, Zionism is a relatively recent phenomenon. Political Zionism, the notion of creating a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine, really is a 19th century phenomenon, and it's a movement of Jewish modernity. Nationalism itself is a modern concept. There were many, many forms of nationalism throughout Europe in the post-Enlightenment and in the modern period, and Zionism was the Jewish version of that. And Zionism, political Zionism, the Zionist movement, really began. It was founded by a Viennese Jew named Theodor Herzl, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, who was a European Jew, very, very deeply influenced by the European nationalism of his day, and believed that Jews would never be safe anywhere in the world unless they had a state of their own, and began a movement that sought to create international support for a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the term Zionism is a complicated term, and it means different things to different people. And up until now, I've been talking about political Zionism, that is the notion of creating a independent Jewish political state in the land. But in the 19th century, Zionism was a vast spectrum of movements. There were political Zionists, but there were also cultural Zionists, for instance. There were religious Zionists. There were labor Zionists. And there was not necessarily agreement among all of them of what Zionism meant. In terms of cultural Zionism, for instance, the most well-known proponent of that stream of Zionism was a man named Ahad Ha'am, which is the pen name for Asher Ginsburg, who was an Eastern European intellectual and writer, who was really, he considered himself a Zionist, but was really opposed to Herzl's notion of creating a political Jewish state. He didn't believe that the problem for Jews was a political problem. He believed it was a cultural problem. In the modern period, there was this dilemma that traditional Judaism was becoming less and less appealing to enlightened Jews of his time, and that either it was being fossilized by traditional Jews, or Jews were just assimilating into European culture. And he believed that in the notion of a Jewish homeland, in other words, moving to historic Palestine and settling there, not necessarily to create a Jewish state, but to create what he called a spiritual center, a spiritual and cultural center that would be the focal point for Jews all over the world. That was a big difference between him and Theodor Herzl. Herzl believed that once a Jewish state in Palestine was created, anti-Semitism would vanish, Jews would either move to Israel or assimilate into the states in which they were living, and Israel would become like other European states, except a Jewish version. Ahad Ha'am was an example of someone who wasn't talking about political independence. He was focused on the land as this cultural place, this cultural center, spiritual center for the Jewish people. So that's important to keep in mind. If you study Zionism, you'll learn that there's many, many different forms. But the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that today I think those differences are fairly academic, because the form of Zionism that has succeeded is political Zionism. It's Herzl's Zionism, right? We have a Jewish state. We have a political Jewish state in the land, finally. And today, when you talk about Zionism, you're really talking about the ideology that's embodied by the living state of Israel. So I think that's an important point, that we can unpack that later if you're interested. But one of the things I think is important to keep in mind is during the origins of Zionism, it was hotly debated. It was not in any way accepted unanimously by the Jewish community. In fact, there were many, many prominent anti-Zionists of the day, and the most important example of that, and the most prominent example, was the Reform movement. Many people are still surprised to know this. You're familiar with the Reform Judaism, correct? So it's the largest Jewish denomination in the United States. It began in Europe, in Germany, and a version of it was imported to the United States, and it became the most important Jewish liberal denomination, and probably remains so to this day in terms of numbers. But in its origins, Reform Judaism was fiercely opposed to Zionism. Reform Judaism, what's known today as classical reform, was very universalistic in its attitude. A very important Reform Jewish leader of the day that was influential in founding American Reform was a rabbi named Isaac Mayer Wise. If you read his works, he spoke strongly against the notion of creating a Jewish state. He felt that was a regression back to an earlier form of Judaism that was unenlightened. And the most famous statement of the Reform movement along these lines is a statement known as the Pittsburgh Platform. And this came out of a Reform Jewish gathering in 1885, November of 1885, where they made a long list of the basic values of Reform Judaism. And among other things, they addressed the issue of Zionism. I want to read to you that piece from the Pittsburgh Platform, just to give you an idea of Reform Judaism's attitude toward Jewish nationalism. This was number 5 of the platform. We recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of the realization of Israel's great messianic hope for the establishment of the kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among men. And again, when they say Israel, they're not talking about the state of Israel. This was written in 1885, so they're really talking about the people of Israel. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine, nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any laws concerning the Jewish state. So, Reform Judaism, one of the most prominent liberal American denominations, was strongly opposed to Zionism. Zionism was a very controversial movement in its origins, and it was only really leading up to and after the establishment of the state in 1948, that Zionism was accepted by the Reform movement. There's actually, and this is an interesting little historical tidbit, in the city in which I live, Evanston, there is the congregation where I used to be the rabbi. There's a second congregation, a Reform congregation called Beth Emet. Is anyone here familiar with, I'm just out of curiosity, ever heard of Beth Emet? It's a largish Reform temple, and it's the entire name is Beth Emet, the Free Synagogue. You see that on the sign outside. And they always hasten to tell you they're not talking about dues when they say they call themselves the Free Synagogue. And I think most of the members of the congregation probably don't know what that means, but what it meant was that back in the early days, the board decided to advocate for freedom of the pulpit. In other words, the rabbi could speak about anything he wanted when the rabbi gave the sermon. And this is often the case in Protestant churches as well, that sermons often had to be approved by the board before the clergy could deliver them. But the reason they became a free synagogue is because David Polish, who was a rabbi who took over in the 1930s and 40s, was a Zionist. And that was a very controversial time, a very controversial thing at the time. The previous rabbi was, like most Reform rabbis of his day, an anti-Zionist, and it was a very controversial thing to have a Zionist as a rabbi of a major Reform temple. So the board of this temple deemed Beth Emet to be a free synagogue, so the rabbi can feel free to espouse these controversial Zionist ideas from the pulpit. So that gives you an idea of how far things have changed, that we just automatically think that Zionism is the normative state of affairs in the Jewish community, but it was not always that way. And I think that's actually starting to change in important ways that I'll talk about. I would be here for a very long time if I gave you the entire history of Jewish opposition to Zionism. So I just want to pinpoint a few important touchstones of that history. It's by no means an exhaustive history, but ones that I think are certainly important to me and that I want to in addition to the Reform movement, mention. The other is an organization called Brit Shalom, which literally means a covenant of peace. And this was an organization that was actually part of the Zionist movement. However, Brit Shalom was, although they considered themselves Zionists, they did not espouse an exclusively Jewish state, and they were also opposed to partition into a Jewish and Palestinian state. They believed in a binational state. They were strongly advocating during the 20s, 30s, and 40s that there should be Arab-Jewish cooperation in one state. However, they were Zionists. They were very much part of the Zionist movement, and that also shows you how far we've come. If you were exposed to the ideas of Brit Shalom today, you would automatically think they're anti-Zionist. But in their day, they were very much part of the Zionist movement, which was a much wider tent before the establishment of the state. There were many important and prominent Jewish figures who were part of Brit Shalom. Rabbi Judah Magnus, who was an American Reform rabbi who moved to Israel, was one of the leaders, one of the founders. He ended up becoming the first president of Hebrew University, one of the founders of Hebrew University. He died shortly after the establishment of the State of Israel. Was a strong and fierce proponent of binationalism. His writings and speeches, of which I'll read to you one, were unabashed in his belief in the importance of Jewish-Arab cooperation. Hannah Arendt, who was the German-Jewish journalist and political philosopher. I'm sure many of you have heard of her. Her most famous work, which was written in the 60s, Eichmann in Jerusalem. But in the early days, she was part of Brit Shalom, and among other things, she wrote very, very strongly about against this notion of Jewish nation-statism, which she believed was going to be national suicide for the Jewish people. Other prominent members of Brit Shalom included Albert Einstein, who was famous for being Albert Einstein, before the establishment of the state, was also a proponent of binationalism, and Martin Buber, the famous Jewish philosopher, who I'm sure you're familiar with as well, participated in this group. And they were all very, very strong opponents of Jewish nationalism, Jewish political nationalism, expressed through an exclusively ethnic Jewish state, and really believed that it was important and in fact possible to create a state that was governed by Jews and Palestinians together. So I want to read to you some of their work, because I think it's very, very important. These are not fringe voices. These are very, very important Jewish voices of the day that I believe have become lost in the fray. And I do believe that the words that I'm about to read to you speak with a remarkable, and I think you'll see this, a remarkable immediacy to our current situation. You know, if you read the words of political Zionists like Theodor Herzl or Chaim Weizmann or David Ben-Gurion, they're interesting historically, but they belong to a certain time and place. Whereas I think many of the issues and the problems and the warnings that some of these members of Brit Shalom were putting out there are just, it's almost heartbreaking when you consider them in this day and age. So I want to read to you first from a piece by Hannah Arendt. And this was something she wrote in 1947, the end of 1947. It was after the UN partitioned the Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, and it's entitled "To Save the Jewish Homeland." And her point was that she was all for a Jewish homeland. In other words, Jews should be able to live in this land because it's their homeland. It has important historic and religious significance for them, but was very, very opposed to Jewish statism. And by titling her essay "To Save the Jewish Homeland," it was her last effort to say we can back away from this madness. There's an alternative. And this was already as hostilities between Jews and Arabs were starting to gear up in the wake of the partition plan. So she wrote, "Many opportunities for Jewish-Arab friendship have already been lost, but none of these failures can alter the basic fact that the existence of the Jews in Palestine depends on achieving it. Moreover, the Jews have one advantage in the fact that, excluded as they were from official history for centuries, they have no imperialist past to live down. They can still live as a vanguard in international relations on a small but valid scale. As in the kibbutzim, they have already acted as a vanguard in social relations, despite the relatively insignificant numbers of the people involved. There is very little doubt about the final outcome of an all-out war between Arabs and Jews. One can win many battles without winning a war, and up to now, no real battle has taken place in Palestine. And even if the Jews were to win the war, its end would find the unique possibilities and the unique achievements of Zionism in Palestine destroyed. The land that would come into being would be something quite other than the dream of world Jewry, Zionist and non-Zionist. The victorious Jews would live surrounded by an entirely hostile Arab population, secluded inside ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense to a degree that would submerge all other interests and activities." This is 1947, by the way, she's reading this. "The growth of a Jewish culture would cease to be the concern of the whole people. Social experiments would have to be discarded as impractical luxuries. Political thought would center around military strategy. Economic development would be determined exclusively by the needs of war. And all this would be the fate of a nation-state, no matter how many immigrants it could still absorb and how far it extended its boundaries. The whole of Palestine and Transjordan is the insane revisionist demand." The revisionist Zionists were led by Menachem Begin and Vladimir Jabotinsky. "Would still remain a very small people, greatly outnumbered by hostile neighbors. Under such circumstances, the Palestinian Jews would degenerate into one of those small warrior tribes about whose possibilities and importance history has amply informed us since the days of Sparta. Their relations with world Jewry would become problematic, since their defense interests might clash at any moment with those of other countries where large numbers of Jews lived. Palestine Jewry would eventually separate itself from the larger body of world Jewry and in its isolation develop into an entirely new people. Thus it becomes plain that at this moment and under present circumstances, a Jewish state can only be erected at the price of the Jewish homeland. So again, she's holding on to this notion. She considers herself a Zionist, and she refers to the important achievements that Zionists had made in Israel beyond just the notion of creating a state, which, as she put it, would create this Jewish Sparta, this small, over-militarized state that's gradually becoming isolated from the rest of the world. And I think you don't need me to tell you how prescient, I believe, her words are. That they are still coming true in many ways. I want to read to you now from Rabbi Judah Magnus. This was written 2 years earlier in 1945, and wasn't quite as desperate an essay, but still strongly proposing that this notion of partition, which was already being talked about seriously at that time, would be deeply problematic as ways that he'll describe. This was written as a letter to the editor of the New York Times, February 1945. And it's a little bit long, but I think it's worth hearing. I won't read the whole thing. The year 1945 will probably be a year of fateful decision for the world, and it behooves those of us who are concerned for the fate of the Holy Land to offer constructive suggestions, if we have any. It is clear that Palestine will not be constituted as either an Arab state or a Jewish state. It is also clear that the White Paper of 1939 offers no hope for future peace development. It is therefore necessary to seek compromise, and the first task of all men of goodwill is to teach and preach compromise and to elaborate such forms of compromise as they believe to be reasonable and practical. The very idea of compromise, the word itself, has been made abhorrent to too many of the inhabitants of Palestine. Their political education has not yet taught them that political compromise is the very breath of life of the Western democracies. I have talked with many Jews and many Arabs during my 22 years in Palestine. Upon this basis, I venture the assertion that a compromise can be found which will be acceptable to the ordinary Jew and the ordinary Arab. The compromise I speak about is one on the basis of which no Arab leader could again get Arabs to revolt and, quote, take to the hills, and no Jewish leader could get Jews to put pressure on the rest of the world. The compromise I speak about is not easy to work out and does not offer a solution overnight, but it is a reasonable answer and is possible of being put into practice. This compromise contains a number of elements, each of which requires careful study and detailed elaboration. On some points this has been done, on others not. What I shall attempt here is but a cursory glance. There are three worlds interested in Palestine: Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. For this reason, any answer to the Palestine question must have interreligious and international character. Politically, the international background may be said to consist of three main factors: the United Nations, the Union of Arab States now coming into being, and the Jewish people. A Middle East Regional Council, the setting up of which by the United Nations, one is bound to assume, would have specific functions in relation to Palestine. And for this purpose, its Palestine section would consist of representatives of these three international bodies. The Jewish representative would be chosen by a reconstituted and strengthened Jewish agency. The Regional Council would be the guarantor of any compromise arrangements that are made. Among other things, this Regional Council would be responsible for security and armed forces, and it would act as the final authority in disputes on basic issues. This Regional Council would have its seat preferably in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the holy city of these three great monotheistic faiths. A historic mission will be fulfilled if Jerusalem can be increasingly the seat of interreligious international organizations. The administration of Palestine should be on a binational basis, namely, partly between Jews and Arabs in government, so that neither would rule the other. It is not easy anywhere in the world to work out administrative machinery for a multinational council. The most successful example is, of course, Switzerland, which has been at peace for generations. But though practical binational constitutions are difficult to achieve, they are not impossible. Some plans have been prepared in this direction, and it is essential that the aid of experts and men of experience be enlisted in this task. One way of meeting some of the difficulties is to give the Middle East Regional Council the power of appointing a high commissioner and a few additional key men who are neither Jews nor Arabs. How long such an arrangement would continue would depend on how a binational constitution for Palestine works generally. But partition of the country, that is a compromise that settles nothing. All it will do is create two irredentas, irreconcilable and activist on either side of the borders. That is the way to never-ceasing warfare, the kind that made the Balkans a byword. Partition also mutilates and cripples the living Jewish conception of the land of Israel, the Holy Land. Partition, furthermore, reduces the area available for Jewish settlements in Palestine. Partition may be a rough and ready way of cutting the Gordian knot, but this surgical operation would kill the patient. If there be no mangling by partition, there is a chance of bringing the diseased body back to health, even though this task be difficult and long drawn out. And he goes on to talk more specifically about what this binational state might look like. I think it's interesting that he was saying that a binational, that a separation between two states was impossible. And in fact, that's what ended up happening. A Jewish state ended up at 1948-49 being created on the backs of the Palestinians. They were either expelled or fled and not allowed to return. And the only way a Jewish state with a Jewish majority was able to be founded was through what we would call today the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their home. But I think his point about partition between a Jewish and Arab state speaks still profoundly today to those who talk about the two-state solution, that say that that's the only way toward peace. And I think his notion that it's an artificial mutilation of the land, I think, is a very important one for us to keep in mind, even though the historical reality we live in is very different than the one in 1948. The final piece I want to read to you comes from a European Jew named Hans Kohn. Any Hans Kohn fans out there? Good. He was a student and colleague of Martin Buber. He originally came from Prague, was part of Brit Shalom in its early days, but actually broke with Brit Shalom, ended up moving to the United States and became a very important political scientist, and in particular on the subject of nationalism. I think he taught at Smith College and other colleges on the East Coast for many years. But he broke with Zionism completely. And he had many important dialogues with Martin Buber, who considered himself a Zionist, even though he believed in a binational state early on. After the establishment of the state, Buber stayed on and made his peace, even though he was very much a gadfly and a critic of the leadership of Israel. Hans Kohn very publicly broke with Zionism for reasons that he writes about in this letter which he wrote to Martin Buber. This was written in 1929. If any of you know the history of what was going on in Palestine in the 1920s, you know why 1929 was an important year? It was the time of Arab riots against great Arab violence, especially in Hebron. And it was in many ways just one of many examples of the bubbling up of these tensions that were created, I believe, by this movement of Jews into Zionists into the land with the express purpose of creating a Jewish presence, a political presence there. And there were others who interpreted this violence in different ways. Hans Kohn saw this as a very important turning point and was very deeply grieved and discouraged by the Jewish leadership's, the Zionist leadership's response to what happened in 1929. And so this was a letter entitled "Zionism is Not Judaism" that Hans Kohn wrote to Martin Buber. Let's see. It has become increasingly clear to me that the Zionist organization has failed utterly. The overwhelming majority of Zionists feel justified in pursuing a course which I cannot follow. For the few who think like me, the need for honest and clear decision has arrived. As a Jew and as a human being, as a Jewish human being, two qualities which in me are inseparable and parallel. I am a pacifist, an anti-imperialist, and what in America is called a radical. I am emphasizing these 3 points because they are called into question by official Zionist policy. I cannot concur with this policy when the Arab national movement is being portrayed as the wanton agitation of a few big landowners. I know all too well that frequently the most reactionary imperialist press in England and France portrays the national movements in India, Egypt, and China in similar fashion. In short, wherever the national movements of oppressed peoples threaten the interests of colonial power, I know how false and hypocritical this portrayal is. I can even less be a party to this approach when such is the attitude of a people which consciously regards itself as a chosen people, and when the future of a movement, the Zionist movement, which I can only envision if it is built on ethical foundations, is at stake. The means determine the goal. If lies and violence are the means, the results cannot be good. We pretend to be innocent victims. Of course the Arabs attacked us in August. Since they have no armies, they could not obey the rules of war. They perpetrated all the barbaric acts that are characteristic of a colonial revolt. But we are obliged to look into the deeper cause of this revolt. We have been in Palestine for 12 years, since the establishment of the British Mandate and the Jewish national home in Palestine, without having even once made a serious attempt at seeking through negotiations the consent of the indigenous people. We have been relying upon Great Britain's military might. We have set ourselves goals which by their very nature had to lead to conflict with the Arabs. We ought to have recognized that these goals would be the cause, the just cause of a national uprising against us. Having come to this country as immigrants, we were duty-bound to come up with constitutional proposals which, without doing serious harm to Arab rights and liberty, would have also allowed for our free cultural and social development. But for 12 years, we pretended that the Arabs did not exist, and we were glad when we were not reminded of their existence. The Arab riots, which were suppressed by the British, should have been met as quickly as possible by peace proposals instead of evasive maneuvers. That was our duty. But just like the powers of the First World War, we have declared that we would gladly make peace if only we were strong enough. That means that we are seeking a victorious peace just as they were, a peace whereby the opponent does what we want. Naturally, each party wants peace on the condition that he can obtain what he considers essential, not, however, a higher form, and not a more lofty conscience. It was against this attitude taken by the powers in the First World War, and against this point of view that the true pacifists rebelled. I would be glad if we also had a few such pacifists among our ranks. If only the Jews could show such courage in their own affairs as was demonstrated, for example, by the English pacifists during the World War. Each delay in the signing of a peace treaty renders peace more difficult by widening the gap between the two peoples. The Arab national movement is growing and will continue to grow. In short time, it will become more difficult for us to reach an agreement than it is today. Increasing our numbers by tens of thousands will not make it any easier. This letter is meant only for you, Martin Buber. Now, of course, we're reading it to everyone. It requires no answer. It deals with questions which each individual must ultimately answer for himself. My resignation closes an era of my life. 20 years spent exclusively in Zionist activity, 10 of them in Keren HaYesod, the Jewish National Fund, is no small part of a human life. One is accountable both to himself and to his friends for such a period. I have written to you about the road which I have now placed behind me. I know very little about the road ahead of me. The old beaten paths of national policy as they were followed by the European peoples in the 19th century, the Eastern peoples in the 20th century, and now by the Jewish people are, for me, no longer valid. We must search for completely new and different paths. Sometimes I still retain a proud hope that the Jews, nationally conscious Jews, might still forge these new paths. Faithfully yours, Hans Kohn. So again, I'm reading you these pieces because these were important, prominent, major Jewish voices of their day. And it's, I believe, just shocking to hear these words now. And these are people who, except for the last one I read, really consider themselves part of the Zionist movement, who were proposing something very different than what was being pursued by the Zionist leadership. They were talking about what we would call today a one-state solution. They would be people, if they existed today, who we would call anti-Zionists, and who many in the Jewish establishment would call self-hating Jews, anti-Semites, what have you. But I hope you can hear in their words that these were people whose Judaism was precious to them, and were speaking as proud Jews, and were in many ways speaking out of Jewish conscience and a desire to save the Jewish people, that somehow this rush to create a political Jewish state would not solve all these problems that it was purporting to address, that it would only create a whole new host of other problems that in fact have come home to roost, I think we see today. And it's just in some ways chilling when you hear Hannah Arendt talking about an over-militarized Jewish Sparta, or Judah Magnus talking about creating borders in the land that will mutilate the land and separate Jews from Arabs, or Hans Kohn talking about missing opportunities and understanding the root causes of Arab violence and Arab resistance to the Jewish presence. It wasn't to the very presence of Jews, but rather it was to the designs of a colonial enterprise that was seeking to create a Jewish state on the backs of the indigenous people, and a word that he himself used. So today we have, with the establishment of the State of Israel, after the Holocaust, rising out of the ashes of the Holocaust, as the Zionist narrative would have it, we have this compelling narrative that the State of Israel is, in many ways, the redemptive moment for the Jewish people. And I think we are seeing that dream that I think is embodied by, what I call the Exodus, notion. Not the book of Exodus in the Torah, but rather the book Exodus by Leon Uris. That was made into a movie with a theme song, "This land is mine, God gave this land to me." That narrative has the cracks in that narrative have become so wide that I think they become impossible to ignore. And I think there are new voices in the Jewish community, particularly in the American Jewish community, that are beginning to find the strength of their convictions and stand down the notion of Jewish colonialism and Jewish nation-statism. Jewish Voice for Peace, which you heard about in the introduction, and you're going to hear from your next speaker, Rachel, Professor Buff, a little bit later about Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm happy to talk to you about them as well. I'm very involved in them also. Is an example of a Jewish organization, really a Jewish community, that is devoted to Jewish values of humanism, of seeing God's presence in all human beings, whether they're Jewish or not, and understanding that any solution to this situation in Israel-Palestine needs to be predicated on the equal rights of all who live there, whether they're Jewish or not. And you will hear this movement, and the Jewish Voice for Peace is really part of a larger solidarity movement, viciously attacked as anti-Semitic, as self-hating, but in fact it's attracting more and more people, and I think for very good reason, because Jews who have had trouble with the narrative that I described to you have been largely marginalized by the Jewish establishment community, by the Jewish organizational community. Jewish Voice for Peace is an example of an organization that has been established in a very grassroots way outside the boundaries of the Jewish establishment. It's speaking to many Jews who used to be part of the Jewish establishment, like myself, but many others who never found a home in it. And we see ourselves as part of a much larger movement, a solidarity movement that understands that Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation are two sides of the same coin, that we can't have one without the other, that they're bound up with each other. And there are not only in the United States Jews who are becoming part of this movement. There are Jews throughout Europe, for instance, in Canada and in Great Britain. There's a group called Independent Voices, which is in many ways a sister movement to JVP. And in Israel, there have been, since the founding of the state, these Jewish voices, and they're the ones who perhaps need our support the most, because they are seriously marginalized, as you might understand, inside Israel. So there are people like Jeff Halper and Yonatan Shapira and Eran Efrati and the refusnik movement, young people who are refusing to engage in military service. And the trend in Israel right now is a very strongly rightward trend, so you can imagine how difficult it is to espouse these kinds of views within Israeli culture. But those voices are quite fearless in coming into their own as well. So I do believe that in many ways the circle is coming around, and it's happening in a different context. But I do think it's very important to return to my original point, to understand that Zionism, it's certainly possible to be a Jew and a Zionist, but it is also very possible to be a Jew and not be a Zionist. I do not consider myself a Zionist anymore. And it's difficult, it probably always will be difficult to hear myself say those words out loud because I've been so socialized during my entire life to consider them to be one and the same. But I do, as someone who's very proud of my Jewish heritage and the heritage that and the spiritual vision that I described to at the very beginning of my speech, the notion of this Jewish peoplehood that can exist throughout the world, this global peoplehood that is multi-ethnic, that's multicultural and transnational, is in many ways an ethic in the 21st century which is so desperately needed, to move away from a particularistic, militaristic, nationalistic expression of Judaism toward a more universalistic and humanistic Judaism is what I believe is what we need to promote in our day and age. So I will stop there. There's much more to say, as always, but I've been talking to you for about an hour, which is about half an hour longer than I intended to. So again, I encourage your thoughts, your responses, your questions, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks again for having me.
If you have a question, let me give you the mic so everybody can hear the question.
I'm going to make the assumption that the success of Israel today, the political Israel, is based on a large portion on funding from the U.S., be it military or cultural or whatever. Would that be a safe assumption to make?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd use the word success, but Israel is heavily dependent, financially dependent on American aid, both financial and military.
Okay.
About $3 billion of military aid a year. Correct.
And that aid, is that, the genesis of that aid, is that driven by the quote-unquote Jewish lobby in the U.S.? And who is the Jewish lobby? And are they in lockstep with the current political powers within Israel?
So I would guard against the use of the term Jewish lobby.
Okay.
I would call it an Israel lobby. Israel advocates, there are Jewish advocates and lobbies for Israel, but there are plenty of non-Jewish members of this lobby. The Christian Zionist contingent is in some ways of which there are more and have in some ways more political clout than the Jews. So I would just guard against a reference to a Jewish lobby, which I think is a problematic term. I mean, I highly recommend the book, The Israel Lobby, by Walter Mersheimer, if you haven't read it, which does a really good job of unpacking what this lobby, the history of this lobby, and how it operates. Christian Zionists, by the way, existed even before Jewish Zionists. The history of Christian Zionism is very, very interesting. The Christian Zionism, which some of you may be familiar with, is rooted in the evangelical notion that Jewish settlement of the land is the precursor to Armageddon and the third coming. And this is a very widespread and politically powerful part of the Israel lobby. You may be familiar with Christians United for Israel, CUFI. Pastor John Hagee is the very well-known head of that movement and is a very, very influential part of the Israel lobby. So, yes, I think there are many reasons why the United States gives the kind of aid, both financial, and not only financial and military aid, but also diplomatic support to Israel. The lobby is one aspect of that, but not the only one. I think in the political calculus of the United States today, Israel is viewed as a very important locus of American influence in the Middle East. And I think that in some ways is even more powerful than the Jewish lobby. In other words, Israel lobby rather. In other words, the second that it becomes clear that Israel is not a strategic asset to the United States, I don't care how powerful the Israel lobby will be, if the politicians in Washington decide that Israel is more of a liability than an asset, I don't think any kind of lobbying will make that much of a difference. So I think right now, especially in the 21st century quote-unquote war on terror, when you look at the importance of Israel, the Israel-U.S. relationship in terms of corporate military alliances, those partnerships make certain powerful and people even more powerful and more influential. And we need to find, I believe we need to find ways to create wedges in those relationships. I think we need to find ways to create leverage to push Israel externally to prove that it's, through its own isolation, it pains me to say, it can't help but change its ways. And that brings us into the whole issue of the popular movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And it's really predicated on the notion of creating a people power that will leverage political power and create ultimately political change. It's a time-honored tactic that I believe does have the power to work and succeed.
Here's
What do you see as the best case scenario? I look at the map of what Palestinian lands were in 48 and along and what small pieces of land they have held on to now. And so let's say that all of our best efforts succeeded and we got our government to stop funding the military, and what exactly are we hoping for? I mean, you got all the settlements that are already built, Israelis living in them, the wall is built. What's the most we can hope for?
I think the most we can hope for, that's easy. The most we can hope for is between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, every individual has full citizenship, full equal rights, full human rights, whether they're Jewish or they're not Jewish. That's the most we can hope for.
But how do you get there?
Oh, well, that's a very different question. That's a much more difficult question. For me, right now, I think we spend too much time trying to parse that question, and I think we're not there yet. In other words, right now, I think the first order of business is to shine a bright light on the abuses that Israel is committing. That's the first order of business. I think the more we talk about political parameters and draw up maps and look at demographics and try to come up with a peace process that's equitable and all this focus on the political dimensions of this, when right now the political dimensions are so inequitable, right? The United States is not an honest broker in this situation, right? The situation is completely skewed toward Israel. So rather than put our faith and spend any time talking about the political parameters of it, of how we get there, I think what we first need to do is put together a popular movement that will bring Israel's behavior out into the public eye. And so that we can create the political room to maneuver, so that we can rewrite that balance that's so inequitable at the moment. I mean, a really good, there are many examples of this that you can think of historic moments where that kind of thing has happened. Selma is a really good example, because that's one that, has recently been, been commemorated now with the movie and the anniversary of it happening. But that moment where on TVs all across the United States, everybody saw the crimes that were being committed in the South for themselves and were outraged, was able to create some political momentum. And it didn't start overnight. There was a political movement that pushed toward that moment, right? But it was able to create the political momentum to push the power players, the political elites, to give them the room to maneuver. I don't believe that. I think it's pointless to debate whether or not President Johnson was a lover of civil rights or not. He was a politician, and politicians don't do anything unless they're pushed to do it. So right now we need to do that. I think the first order of business is to do the pushing, right? To build this movement, this popular movement that is quite significant and is making great gains. To push the political players so that I think eventually that roadmap that you're asking about will reveal itself. But we need an equitable playing field before we can do that, and we do not have that now. So even to talk about how we get from here to there, when the United States is quote-unquote the honest broker and is giving one side $3 billion of aid, of military aid that side uses against the other side, is not in any way a recipe for equity. So that's why I am unabashedly part of this popular movement that's seeking to leverage change. And the change, I think the options that we have before us will reveal themselves once we are able to create those political moments.
Anyone else? There we go.
Are there any individuals in the House or the Senate that you have some thought could be pushed? Because I find it amazing that I had not heard one statement from any politician that they would be sympathetic to the Palestinian point of view.
I could name individual names. I think I think you would start with the Progressive Caucus, obviously. People like, Keith Ellison and Jan Schakowsky. Jan Schakowsky happens to be my congressperson, and I've had long conversations with her. And these people are politicians. I think, again, I'm not discounting the importance of the political sphere, but I think we spend too much time, right, I think, looking to the politicians to be our saviors. And right now it looks very dire. You're absolutely right in terms of where they're at on this issue. But political grounds shift. Here's another example. I'll give you another example. I mentioned the civil rights movement in South Africa, all right? And I'm old enough to remember this one. I remember the anti-apartheid bill when it was passed, and Reagan vetoed it, and the Congress overrode his veto. And I remember how mind-boggling that moment was, because not that long before, it was unthinkable. The call for sanctions, was considered just, extremist. And then I remember this. I was right after Mandela died. I was watching a YouTube video, and you can see it. It's quite remarkable. It was from Nightline. Ted Koppel did a town meeting with Mandela's his first visit after he was out of prison. He came to the United States. Apartheid had not fallen yet, but it was this huge at a college. I don't know which one, but it was a huge gathering. And I remember one of the questions that was raised was the sanctions. The anti-apartheid bill was still operable. There were still sanctions against South Africa, and they were debating whether or not they should lift the sanctions because apartheid had not yet fallen. And Mandela was saying, no, we got to keep the sanctions on. And this Republican senator got up and was talking about, no, we got to keep the sanctions on, this apartheid regime is immoral, and it was just mind-boggling to me to hear a politician saying such things when I have no doubt that same politician, not that long before, was, cozying up to the apartheid regime as an important ally in the United States. So political grounds shift, politicians certainly shift depending on what they believe are their best interests. And I think it's easy to get discouraged when you look at the scorecard, political scorecard now, but I think we need to take a step back, have a little less faith in our politicians right now, and spend much more time building a movement that will push them so that they will have to make these decisions, or they have the political grounds to make them in the case of many of these politicians, I believe.
Anyone else?
So when did you change from being a Zionist? And how much of a minority are you? And are you on the edge, or?
That depends who you ask. And I don't necessarily think the edge is a bad place to be either. A lot of really important stuff happens on the edges. As I said before, I've always entertained certain issues about Zionism, little voices that I would sort of debate myself, some of my assumptions about Israel and Palestine and Zionism in general. Some of them had to do with this notion of ethnic nationalism. In other words, that a Jewish state could only be predicated on the maintenance of a Jewish demographic majority in the land. I just think whenever you predicate a state on the majority of one people over another, that other people are going to end up with the short end of the stick, right? And you often hear very liberal, progressive Zionists talking about the importance of a two-state solution, not necessarily for moral reasons, but because they talked about what they call the demographic threat. That the Palestinian birth rate was such that if we didn't create two states, they would overrun the Jewish majority, and there would be a Jewish minority. I remember distinctly thinking, Palestinians are a demographic threat? I mean, it sounds like Pharaoh talking about the Israelites, at the beginning of the book of Exodus. What would we say if one of our politicians got up and said this certain ethnic group was a demographic threat to the integrity of the United States? I mean, what word would we use to describe that kind of attitude, right? But yet it was okay for nice liberal Zionists to talk about demographic threats. I was never able to sort of square myself with that question. And just other questions about the circumstances surrounding the maintenance of how Israel was established. When I started to read the Israeli historians who were writing about the circumstances that were very different than the ones the narrative I was raised on, what I would call the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people. Also, I think, I've always been a very progressive person politically. That's something I inherited from my own family, and very much a part of the peace movement, very anti-militarist in my approach. And yet when it came to Israeli militarism, I'd always sort of make an exception. I had no trouble protesting American militarism, in fact, I was very compelled to do it. But when it came to Israeli militarism, I remember during the Lebanon War, I said, well, that's complicated, And so those were just some of the issues I had, and they didn't go away. They just got greater and greater. And as things got more dire, at least it seemed to me getting more dire, it became harder for me to vanquish those voices. And the final, straw was in 2008, 2009, when Operation Cast Lead, the war, not 2 wars ago. Actually, war is not the right word. I would call it massacre in Gaza. And that was when I just felt I can't do this anymore. I can't keep rationalizing this behavior and explaining it away, especially as a congregational rabbi. I felt a great deal of anguish, that I think it wasn't just my own view anymore. It was that I was sort of hewing that middle road, that equivocating middle road, because I was fearful, as a congregational rabbi, of what might ensue. So that I started going down that road, I would call a road of Palestinian solidarity after 2008, 2009. that's what sort of led me in a different direction and eventually got me to publicly break with Zionism.
So it seems like you were in Israel when you were in the college age? How did you not get drafted? How did you not get drafted?
Oh no, I wasn't an Israeli citizen. I was there as a visiting American. Yeah. I wouldn't say, to answer your question about, am I a minority, am I a, I will tell you, and this is just anecdotal, that since I've gone down this path, I can't tell you how many Jews have come up to me, both inside my congregation and outside, saying thank you. I've been afraid to say these things out loud, and it really helps to hear a rabbi say them. I hear people say, I felt alienated from my own community because of this one issue, and I thank you for saying this out loud. And I think there's been a significant portion of the Jewish community that's been silenced over this issue, or alienated or isolated over this issue. And I think they're finding their voice. I will also say that a younger generation of Jews just blows me away. I think they're being raised with just completely different assumptions about Israel and Palestine in general. And they don't have any of the angst that I've been describing that I had. They see this, what Hannah Arendt predicted, they see this small, over-militarized garrison state in the Middle East and say, what does this have to do with my Jewishness? Why do I have to, pay fealty to this state in order to be, part of the Jewish community? And the leadership of JVP, is Jewish Voice for Peace, includes a huge cadre of young people who are quite fearless on this issue and are standing up as Jews, saying we're proud Jews and we refuse to make this be the sine qua non of our Jewish identity. And so I think the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction, toward the direction of some of the thinkers that I mapped out at the beginning of my talk. I really do believe.
Any others? Well, let me say how much we appreciate you being here. I appreciate educational moments, and this has certainly been one. And we have a little gift.
Thank you.
A peace cup from
my Racine mug.
Yeah, Racine mug.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
An authentic voice, a voice we don't get to hear very often, but it's deep and provocative and helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.